Thank you very much, Laura, for those instructions and for all your help in organizing and engineering tonight's unusually ambitious meeting of our Françoise and Georges Selz endowed lectures in 18th and 19th century French decorative arts and culture. I'm Jeffrey Collins, Professor of Art History and Material Culture at Bard Graduate Center and convener of the Selz Lectures. And on behalf of the director, Susan Weber, and all my colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 17th year of our Selz series. Those of you who can remember back to the before days will recall that both of our planned Selz lectures from spring of 2020 had to be canceled, unfortunately, so we will be looking to reschedule both of those as soon as the circumstances permit. In the meantime, we have a special treat with tonight's event, which departs from precedent not just in being held via Zoom, but in bringing not one, but three accomplished scholars to the Selz podium in the same evening, and you'll hear more about them shortly. I'm going to depart from tradition in a third way as well, namely by kicking off not with a traditional introduction, but with a video that does a good deal of my work for me. It lasts about 2 minutes, and then I will rejoin you to start the formal part of our program. Laura, would you kindly cut the lights and cue the film? Okay, great, thank you. Well, that is definitely the publicity that every scholar dreams of for their work. So I thank Harvey Miller Publishers for sharing that very alluring visual précis of tonight's events. We also realized that the publication information went by fairly fast, and since we can't sell books in person as we'd hoped, we will put a link to both the European and the US distributors in the chat feature. So indeed, as scholars of the 1720 bubbles will well know, the project about which we're going to hear tonight is an international story that engages both Europe, the traditional purview of the Selz lectures, and the wider world, including Louisiana, the Mississippi, and the South Seas. It's a reminder of how continents, cultures, and peoples became intertwined for good and evil in the early modern period. And I hope that we can take a moment to consider the ways that colonial legacies of occupation, abduction, dispossession, and forced labor continue to haunt the places and institutions within which we live and work. I also hope that each of us can use our scholarship to recover and, where possible, repair those injustices. Okay, meltdown. Tonight's event, as you just saw, is about the power of the invisible and the intangible to rain down ruin and thereby reshape the world. Sound familiar? To credit the project with Delphic foresight might be going too far since it was planned before recent unfortunate events. But as we'll hear, the question of historical echoes and anniversaries was there from the beginning. Our guides are Nina Dubin, Associate Professor of Art History and Affiliate Faculty in the Department of French and Francophone Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. As the trailer noted, she's particularly interested in the relation of art and risk, issues she explored in her book Futures and Ruins, 18th Century Paris and the Art of Hubert Robert, published by the Getty in 2010. It's also a theme she's exploring in other studies of the visual culture of letters and epistolary themes in 18th century French art. Madeleine Viljoen is curator of prints and the Spencer Collection at the New York Public Library, where she oversees an important holding of manuscripts, fine illustrated books, and livres d'artistes, as well as over 200,000 prints in a broad range of media. Besides having curated several previous exhibitions at the library and elsewhere, including the early modern painter etcher, she's published widely on early modern ornament prints on Christoph Jamnitzer, Hendrik Holtzius, Raphael, and most recently on printed self-portraits by women at the turn of the 19th century. Meredith Martin, who has the distinction of already having served as a Selz lecturer, is Associate Professor of Art History at New York University, where she specializes in French art and material culture of the 17th through 19th centuries, with particular interest in France's role in the wider world. She's the author of Dairy Queens, The Politics of Pastoral Architecture from Catherine de' Medici to Marie Antoinette, published by Harvard in 2011. A new book, The Sun King at Sea, Maritime Art and Galley Slavery in Louis XIV's France, co-authored with Gillian Weiss, is forthcoming from the Getty later this year. And for full disclosure, I should add that I was privileged to have collaborated with Meredith on a study of early modern ship-shaped incense boats published by Brill in 2018. Now, the order of service for tonight is that Meredith will kick us off with a short introduction to the project. After that, we'll hear from Nina. Meredith will again come back to us with some remarks of her own before she hands it off to Madeleine. Then we'll all rejoin for a brief roundtable discussion before opening up the floor to questions and comments from all of you following the protocols laid out by Laura. So Meredith, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Jeffrey. I'm really honored to be a two-timer in the Selz series, and I'd like to thank you and Laura, our Graduate Center, and the Selz family for having us all here tonight. It's really wonderful to come and share this project, the book, the exhibition, various kind of iterations of this really fun collaboration that we've had together over the past few years, despite the pandemic and the challenges that have ensued, which you'll hear a little bit about. We are doing a kind of tag team event tonight, a little bit of back and forth, which hopefully will help prevent Zoom fatigue. And I just wanted to briefly kick us off with a couple of intro images and just to talk a little bit about the scope of the project. And then Nina's going to pick up the ball. So let me see here. Here's my desktop. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, okay. So I have a little bit of a title slide, although we've already been given a wonderful introduction by Jeffrey and by our trailer that the fabulous Harvey Miller, Breppels, and Johan van de Beek, our publisher, put together, which I agree, they're sort of, we were thrilled when we saw, when they sent that to us. But I have just here a couple of our kind of signature images related to the exhibition to get us all a little bit in the mood. The cover of our book Meltdown, which Jeffrey already held up, which you saw. There's a detail here, crop detail here on the left. This is one of the signature images from the Taffarel series, the English title, The Great Mirror of Folly, which is the series of satirical prints, plays, stock documentation, and other kind of compilation of all sorts of visual and textual material related to the Mississippi and South Sea bubbles that began to be compiled, printed, published, and circulated in 1720, kind of at the moment that this financial collapse was taking place. And this is a wonderful hand-colored version of this Picard print, which you'll hear more about later on in the talk, which we're able to include in our exhibition. It's in the NYPL's collection. And then on the right, you see a couple of other types of objects that are going to be in the show. So most of the exhibition itself, which is scheduled to open in September of 2021, about 11 months after we had originally planned to open it in October 2020. But the majority of works will be from this Great Mirror of Folly series of satirical prints, all of which are owned. The New York Public Library has wonderful examples of prints from this series, most of which are unbound, which gives us a really unique opportunity to display them on the wall. And they also have a few different editions of the tafereel itself bound. So we're going to be showing a bound version in the exhibition as well. And then other kind of ephemera and material associated with the 1720 bubbles, including paper money, also held as part of the Maitland collection at the NYPL. This is a John Law paper bill that you're looking at the top right. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this. We had planned to show several 3D objects that were loans, which in the end we aren't going to be able to actually show in the exhibition. But this plate, which is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, is a wonderful example of the kind of speed and distance at which news and information about the bubbles circulated. This was a plate made in Canton by Chinese export painters who sent it back for the Dutch market. Probably images, we're not sure exactly how they came across these prints and images that served as a basis for these series of porcelain plates that they made, but they seem to have received them very soon after 1720, and these plates were made within the first few years after the bubble collapse, and then quickly came back to the Dutch market. And for us, it really embodies the global reach of these bubbles. And we're referring to this as, the world's first bubble economy, or the first international bubble economy. And some people have asked, well, what about Tulip Mania? That happened in the Netherlands about a century prior. And that is in some ways a kind of better known financial disaster or catastrophe, which is referenced in some of the images in the tafereel, but it was a bit more localized to the Netherlands and to Europe. And this collapse really did have global repercussions. And this plate from Canton, I think, really exemplifies that. And then just to say briefly before I turn it over to Nina, there are many different parts of this project. One of them is the book, which it's very much kind of related to the show, but it's also meant to serve as a kind of standalone publication. And that's fortunate in the end, because the production of the book was not delayed, unlike the exhibition. So it did come out almost a year earlier. And it has a different title. Originally, the exhibition was going to be called Meltdown. And then round about March or April of last year, we kind of all realized that a big banner above the library with the words Meltdown emblazoned on it might not be the best thing to do given the current climate. So we have changed the title of the exhibition to Fortune and Folly in 1720. And you're looking at a wonderful kind of graphic preview of our title and some of the design for the show, which I'll show you a little bit later on. And then a third piece of it is a special issue of the online journal, Journal 18, that Nina and I co-edited on 1720, which has wonderful contributions by different authors who were working on this topic, which came out last fall, and which also very much relates to this whole kind of history that we're exploring in a variety of different ways. And then just one last point, which is to say that you might notice that there's a lot of 2D imagery in our presentation, a lot of prints. And it is true that the majority of our exhibition focuses on printed material. And this is a lecture on decorative arts. We do have some objects that we're thinking about decorative arts in an expanded field. We certainly do have some objects in this presentation that qualify as decorative arts. And we just wanted to remind our audience that some of the most wonderful kind of interior design schemes and luxury good production of the 18th century was made possible through the wealth that was accrued and some of the fortunes that were made through this stock trading. Not everyone lost money in this collapse. Those who were in the sort of highest echelons of the government, who had certain kinds of connections, what today we would call insider traders, did end up profiting. They took out their money early. They had a little bit of advance information. And so some of the most important patrons and collectors of the age, who we have to remember, were involved in this colonial trade, as well as the stock speculation. One example being the Comtesse de Verrue, whose ceiling, designed by Audran, this oval ceiling that you see on the left, has been reinstalled in this wonderful period room in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. There was a huge interior design scheme planned for John Law's Banque Royale in Paris, including a monumental painted ceiling, by the artist Pellegrini, and this staircase, which was disassembled and has been reinstalled in the Wallace collection in London. And you can see in this detail, this kind of cornucopia of coins, of wealth and abundance spilling out, that was meant to sort of strike, awe and wonder in visitors coming to this bank. And then Chantilly porcelain, and I just bring this in because the Prince de Condé, it's not often known, he actually profited hugely off this scheme, having taken out his money, insisted on transforming his paper money into specie quite early on, and not long afterwards started the Chantilly porcelain production manufactory. So there's a lot to say about the relationship between this history and decorative arts and luxury good production in France in this period. Okay, I'm gonna stop and let Nina take over.
Thank you so much, Meredith and Jeffrey and Laura, and I'm grateful to be here with all of you virtually. I will start sharing my screen. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes just to give a sort of overview of the bubbles and some of the themes that we explore in both our publication and the exhibition. So when we initially came up with Meltdown as our title, we didn't fully appreciate the term's appropriateness. The word doesn't enter the lexicon until the 20th century, and it didn't necessarily have an equivalent in 1720. But what we discovered is that the melting metaphor was just as useful to commentators then as it was in the following century to Marx, who of course famously summarized his epic as one in which all that is solid melts into air. One of our exhibition's arguments is that the reason the 1720 caricatures were so effective is that they offered a shorthand and entertaining means of making sense of the otherwise bewildering facts of economic life. Images like these tell the story of an overheated market by casting the orchestrators of the bubbles as Lucifers or else as criminals consigned to hell. In this so-called medley prints, a trompe-l'oeil send-up of paper deception, a raging fire at upper right heralds the crumbling into smoke of pipe dreams. In their own way, such prints served as their era's version of The Big Short, which helped a mass audience understand how a US housing bubble triggered a worldwide financial disaster. Another popular motif was the Devil's Cauldron. This example by Bernard Picard portrays a grotesque John Law, mastermind of the Mississippi bubble, shown clutching a phallus-like money bag. A hapless investor at right tosses his gold into the pot, only for it to be converted into worthless paper. At bottom left, a monstrous figure keeps the fire beneath the brew going by tossing in discredited stock shares. The caricature was based on a popular song that lampooned John Law's plan as diabolical alchemy. Law's system, as it was called, for converting debt into wealth rested on the infusion of paper credit into the French economy, first by way of paper money in the form of new banknotes, and then by way of shares in the Indies Company, a state-run corporation that oversaw the commercial development of French Louisiana. Here, personifications of envy, despair, and even at right of Rue Quincampoix, the street where stock trading took place, wield torches that emblematize a destructive spread of speculation mania, as well as the swiftness with which fortunes melted into air. As displayed on the shield held by the figure of Vanity, the falling figure of Icarus, whose wings were melted by the sun, completes the metaphor. The 1720 crash literally corresponds to the definition of a meltdown in that it followed on the heels of Europe's Little Ice Age, a freeze that a decade earlier had destroyed harvests, caused famine, and consequently readied investors to associate salvation with New World trading ventures. This fantastical view of New Orleans by François Gérard Jolin stoked speculative desire by conjuring horizons of plenty for an audience accustomed to privation. Depicting the still embryonic port city as a tropical paradise replete with fertile pastures, gold-laden mountains, and indigenous innocents eager to trade precious metals for trinkets, the engraving disseminated a fiction of limitless opportunity on behalf of France's Indies Company. In today's parlance, the print marks a new appreciation of the power of a compelling narrative to ignite spontaneous optimism, or conversely, dread. When the economist Robert Schiller invokes the power of a galloping storyline to move markets, he is in fact echoing the sentiments of none other than John Law. In a 1720 letter, Law instructed the French regent, Philippe d'Orléans, that the value of company stock lay in nothing more substantial than language. Quote, help to back it, speak well of it. You will heighten the confidence of those about you, and that confidence will support the thing itself. The problem with Law's system was that it was all confidence and not a lot in the way of thing. France's bank overprinted paper money, exchangeable for Indies Company stock, even as the Louisiana colony underperformed. Precisely this incommensurability takes expression in Jolin's print. What is interesting here is less the abundance of dazzling riches than their peculiar absence. Jolin's depiction of commerce is more accurately a portrayal of faith, of the acquisition, that is, of the most coveted object of all, belief itself. The lengthy description below ends by noting the progress of missionaries in winning the indigenous population over to Catholicism, as illustrated by the profession of faith made by this figure at left. Jolin visualizes the essence of a system that sought to convert not only gold into paper and paper into money, but more generally a skeptical populace into a trusting one. The print's indoctrinated subjects, then, implicitly include the French as well, a people acculturated to place its confidence in the mystical workings of credit. This 1720 print of Stock Share Mania on Rue Quincampoix, subsequently reproduced in the medley print at right, testifies to Law's success in implementing his vision of confidence as the basis for prosperity. The print captures the crush of the crowd that daily assembled to buy and sell securities during the heyday of the bubble, a period that witnessed not only a building boom, but also the invention of a new terminology. The words millionaire and nouveau riche derive from this period, as does the creation of the modern wallet, redesigned to meet the needs of a paper economy. For Law, the magic of paper credit lay once more in the power of narrative. As he put it, quote, an estate in specie does not increase by speaking, but an estate in credit improves wonderfully by it. Not for nothing does the most famous caricature of 1720, also by Picard, elevate the goddess Fame above all other figures. Sidekick of the devil, shown blowing bubbles beside her, Fame, with her two trumpets, fulfills her ancient reputation as maker of noise, as source of unverified gossip. Paper's capacity to accrue value at the speed of rumor is here parodied by the personification of fake news. Buoyant on a gaseous plume, the goddess appears from behind, the better to suggest her use of yet a third wind instrument, namely her derriere. As exemplified in Bernard Barron's adaptation of the work for an English audience, Picard's print was itself a widely talked about international sensation. This caricature of Law at right deploys a similar iconography. Its imagery of clouds, bellows, and the absurdly airborne recalls Montesquieu's satire of John Law as a peddler of wind, whose sales pitch is as follows, quote, you think you are rich. Trust me, abandon the country of base metals. Come into the empire of the imagination. If you have creditors, go and pay them with what you have imagined, and tell them to imagine in their turn. Along with works by Picard, this etching and others that I'm showing appeared in a 1720 publication of 1720 satirizing the bubbles titled The Great Mirror of Folly. With their bilingual address, its prints capitalized on an international perception of the bubble economy as a commerce in wind, and a malodorous one at that. This caricature, based on a contemporaneous play, spoofs those who heeded law's call to enter into the empire of the imagination, thereby mistaking filthy lucre for divine incarnation. Overturning the religious imagery marshaled in propaganda like Jolan's, it features law squatting on an altar-like pedestal above his worshipful flock, defecating a bill into the hands of a speculator. Like priests administering communion, two attendants pour coin through a funnel into law's mouth. The print ridicules the worthlessness of overvalued securities and the credulity of a nation that infused the stock market with Eucharistic belief. What the work registers is that conversion, and more specifically paper as a sign of convertibility, lay at the heart of law's system. The financier, after all, had persuaded the public to convert its fortunes into banknotes, which were in turn deemed convertible by various state edicts into Indies company stock shares. As spelled out on France's new currency, its value lay only in the promise of its future convertibility. For this reason, commentators described the paper economy as marking the transition from stable, durable wealth to what Montesquieu called movable effects. Movement, replete with scatological implications, is thematized in the caricature. At lower right, Mercury, the god of commerce, has been immobilized in a cage and tortured with a wind bellows. His confinement emblematizes the sidelining of honorable merchants during the wind trade. The worried man kneeling nearby points at a monkey's conjuring trick and asks who will gain. The question underscores paper's failure to be converted into anything other than endlessly deferrable promises. The god's entrapment also speaks to the reversal of values affected by speculation, when the hypothetical worth of paper instruments eclipsed the value of real assets. Prints like these visualize the dawn of what commentators described as the papered century, an era awash in newfangled portable assets. Put simply, in the papered century, things were valuable to the extent that they moved. To quote J.G.A. Pocock, quote, property had ceased to be real and had become not merely mobile, but imaginary as well. For all their humor, many such caricatures channeled various social anxieties unleashed by the bubbles. In this example, the density of the crowd preys on concerns about the melting down of boundaries between population segments that were normally segregated from one another. A travesty of a triumphal procession, the print features, in lieu of royals, the figure of John Law crowned by a fool's cap and vomiting stock shares. Speculation sickness has infected and thereby equalized everyone, collapsing the differences that formerly ordered the social hierarchy. Even the boundaries between mortals and immortals have been violated, evidenced in the presence of the devil shown injecting John Law with wind, the demonic sea mammals crossing through the portal at right, and the mythological types in the clouds above, including Jupiter, Mercury, and the falling Phaeton. In visualizing investors fraternizing with deities, such prints, among other things, spoofed French corporate propaganda. The semi-official Nouveau Mercure routinely spread tales of the miracles occasioned by Law's system. In one such item from early 1720, the goddess of the royal bank arranges for banknotes to fall like hail. Exactly such an image appears in Picard's caricature. The work documents the speculating mobs that nightly descended on Amsterdam's Kalverstraat. It also places them alongside a chorus of divinities, allegorical figures, and corporate personifications, thereby mocking a media industry that promoted the magical potential of the system. Above, the goddess Fortuna disseminates more than stock shares and bubbles. The minuscule labels she scatters, interspersed with serpents and fool's caps, sentence their recipients to suffer conditions of insomnia, sadness, confidence, and other volatile emotional states. Fortuna asserts the menace of credit finance. Not only is her wheel shown trampling an honest merchant, but so too does she embody the threat of a hysteria-prone marketplace. At bottom left, a John Law lookalike seated with his legs apart engages with a deferential companion. Such homosocial interactions play on fears of effeminization in a culture of easy money. Within months of the print's completion, Picard updated it with a second version. Among the notable changes, Picard has replaced the two conversing men at lower left with a dramatic confrontation between a distraught woman and a sinister male suitor. The former is shown resigned to the advances of the latter, a Jew who kneels to kiss her hands while bribing her with a promissory note in the amount of £50,000 and a contract for £1,000 worth of South Sea shares, which by that point had already been discredited. The crying ingenue named Phyllis in the print is on the verge of reversing her financial losses by selling herself. As the lettering below warns, if you lose your honor, that, alas, can never be restored. Ruined by speculation, that is, by her own overwrought imagination, Phyllis embodies the irreversible costs of gambling on fictive assets. Her tragedy marks a pan-European fixation on the endangered status of female chastity in a society remade by mobile wealth. Picard's was one of many bubble-era prints that told the story of financial betrayal through the lens of amorous misadventure. The Great Mirror of Folly's title page shows a courting John Law beseeching a sorceress to lend his scheme her powers of bewitchment. The Cupids above prepare to wreak heartbreak and financial havoc alike. Long after 1720, French culture deployed the lessons of love as a guide to navigating the perils of a paper economy. I'll end with a few examples from the expanded field of the decorative arts, which date to the twilight of the papered century. These include the modish secrétaire, a movable good designed to safeguard the secret letters and financial records of the kinds of women encountered in the age's epistolary novels. The trompe-l'oeil conceit of Topino's writing desk at left markets itself to a clientele acquiescent to the uncertain trustworthiness of paper transactions. In another feat of trompe-l'oeil, this set of buttons designed for a man's tailcoat features delicate sheets of paper, landscape drawings topped by love notes, a layering that creates a false impression of spatial depth. The messages playfully ironize their own sincerity through a feat of visual trickery. They also ape the anonymity of the age's monetary instruments. The prospect that a lover's avowal might be insubstantial, feigned, or transferable served as a cultural leitmotif at the same time that ever-growing numbers of people were learning to adjudicate the credibility of paper promises. The gambles of love, in other words, provided a training ground for the risks of living in the age of bubbles. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to pick it back up here and try to be relatively brief to move it on to Madeleine. Let me share my screen again. So as you can see, we are, as you've heard, we're trying to tell a fairly complicated story. You know, we wanted to tell this story of the 1720 collapse of the Mississippi and the South Sea bubbles. And we wanted to do it in part because it was last year was the tercentenary, the 300-year anniversary of this collapse. And it's one that has enduring resonance today in terms of our own financial uncertainty, the 2008 bubble collapse, even the recent, I don't even know what to describe it because I'm not even sure what GameStop is, but it certainly has analogies. And one of my students even today in the seminar compared the Toffereal satirical prints to the kind of virtual viral memes that we're now all living with to deal with various kinds of crises from, I don't know if it's a crisis that Ted Cruz went to Cancun. People took great pleasure in that, but also in terms of the GameStop phenomenon. So it has a lot of resonance. It was the 300-year anniversary. Now it's a year delayed because of the pandemic, but you know, pretty well, so pretty well and good. So, and the three of us have a shared interest in intersections of art and money, in print culture, in early modern trade and exchange. And we really wanted to tell this story, both in this book publication and in the exhibition. But as you've already noticed, no doubt, these prints are extremely dense, multi-layered with lots of different kind of imagery, very difficult to parse. Even modern scholars can't really figure out what to make of these images and also of the story, the bubbles itself. Was John Law this malevolent force? Was he kind of an early economic genius? Did people really lose a huge amount of money? It's still kind of shrouded in mystery to some extent. And so we were trying to figure out a way to clarify, to tell the story and also to engage audiences and not to turn them away from this very dense and difficult imagery. And so one of our solutions, at least in terms of the book publication, was to take a cue from the theatrical metaphors that pervade these prints and to put in the middle of our book this kind of playbill filled with a cast of characters that we ourselves chose, that we felt, some of them are mythological goddesses, figures like Fortuna. Some of them are real life characters like John Law, that recur in these images and that really also allow us to speak to some of its most prevalent themes, as well as to bring up other issues and other sorts of representations of objects that show up in the exhibition. And so this is just a image from the middle of the book that our designer did a kind of 18th century inspired playbill of these characters. And I'm just going to take you through a couple of them. John Law himself, the kind of star, the mastermind of this whole scheme. These short essays that we wrote about these characters both allow us to kind of tease out some of the, the specificities of these individuals or of these kind of allegorical figures, but also to show different kinds of objects, to do other kinds of work. And one of them is another wonderful objects from the Metropolitan Museum. And because we had to change venues within the library, we can now only show collections-based objects. So it's another wonderful reason why we're so happy to be here tonight lecturing within the Selz series, because we can kind of salvage that, the sort of, sad fate of the lack of being able to show these loans in the exhibition and to show them here virtually to you tonight. But this object in the right is a tobacco box, which, as you can see, directly takes or replicates one of the prints from the Tafereel, which depicts, as Nina already mentioned, John Law sitting atop a kind of pile of wind. And it's also, it shows the kind of circulation of this imagery in different media, but it also refers to tobacco, which was one of the colonial projects that Law pledged to produce in Louisiana. And to do that, he promised to the Compagnie des Indes that he would send 6,000 French citizens, mostly vagrants, criminals, prostitutes, and other undesirables that he pledged to kind of send through forced migration to Louisiana to provide its labor force, as well as 3,000 enslaved Africans who were also part of this story, but who, interestingly enough, or disturbingly, do not get represented regularly within the Tafereel. It's a series of prints that are replete with all sorts of different images and references, but that history of forced migration and enslaved labor is not that often referenced. One exception is in this vignette of this larger print, which really mobilizes that kind of all the world's a stage metaphor. And then at the top left, you see an image of figures who are being round up and chained and presumably sent on a ship to be sent off to Louisiana. So we speak about that subject in the John Law essay. We also show other media, including these wonderful satirical medals that are in the collection of the American Numismatic Society, in which we're going to try to have replicated as 3D, 3D models within the exhibition, which would speak, I think, to the idea of replication and illusionism and trickery. So it would work out quite well as a conceit, but which show John Law here, blowing a bellows with paper money or stock shares scattering around. And then the one on the bottom right is this wonderful kind of narrative of how one can become a millionaire overnight, buy a farm, buy a carriage, and then eventually end up within a week at the hospital in Bedlam to go insane through the rapidity of the speed at which fortunes can be made and lost overnight. And then the Canton plate, which I already mentioned. There's also an essay on Madame Law or Madame Compagnie, who's a recurring figure in the Tafereel that speaks both to this kind of power of these female allegorical, these goddesses like Fortuna, Folly, who pervade the series, but also to real life women who were heavily involved and were major players in this trade, who set up their own shingles to trade stocks on the Rue Quincampoix, or who assisted Law, his common law wife, known as Madame Law here, is represented in this print. And then this letter on the right, which is in the collection of the Morgan, and we hope to have a facsimile written by Alexander Pope to Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, giving her extremely bad investment advice, telling her to buy South Sea stock, which will certainly rise. You know, as I think I said to my students, he should have kept his day job. You know, it was so great on the investment advice, but it's a wonderful kind of a document. And we also have in YPL's collection a dividend from Sir Isaac Newton, who was also, there were a lot of very famous people heavily invested in this scheme. There's an essay on the banknote, which we have personified as a character, taking a cue from the popular it narratives of the 18th century. And as some of you may have seen the Selz lecture, I think this was last year by David Pullins on Le Sofa, one of the most famous 18th century French it narratives, but we've made him a kind of character, maybe the son. I don't know if he, I think of him as a he, I'm not sure actually if he has a gender, but the child of John, the progeny of John Law, who narrates his own kind of sad fate once his father deems him to be worthless. There's also the figure of the King of the Mississippi, who's a recurring character and who connects to the Jolin print that Nina showed earlier, and this kind of New World propaganda in which we have some maps in the exhibition. You think of maps as objects that are kind of empirical surveys of a territory, or maybe you don't. Maybe we all know that maps can lie and can embellish and can fudge the truth. But certainly in the case of these propaganda and some of these maps that were produced for the Compagnie des Indes, there's a kind of play with scale, an idealization, and even a kind of fictive fake news relative to the promised abundance of gold mines and other sorts of natural resources and riches that were to be found, the illusory promise of this existence in this new territory. And in this print on the left, representing the so-called King of the Mississippi, who's a kind of fictive character represented in images and texts referred to as the Grand Soleil, which is also the title that was used to describe the leader of the Natchez community of indigenous Native Americans within the Mississippi Valley and within the Louisiana Territory, whom French propagandists described as being extremely open and receptive and welcoming to European, those who arrived in this territory. And there's a little vignette behind him that says, "Dream of gold mines." So again, this kind of promise of happy harmony and communion and abundance that could be gained from this exchange. As you know, the story did not end happily on either side, as many of you may know. And then several other figures that we write about, who I won't, in the interest of time, I won't go into, but the figure of Atlas, of Mercury, of Icarus, you know, the falling stockbroker, you know, the sort of hubristic fall from grace, Harlequin. There's several references to Commedia dell'arte figures throughout the Tafereel. There's also different kinds of images. This is the frontispiece to the play that Nina mentioned, Harlequin Stock Jobber, which was also included in the Tafereel. The whole reason we know that these printmakers were actually publishing and circulating this in 1720 is that the playwright of the guy who wrote, the Dutch playwright who wrote Harlequin Stock Jobber, sued one of the Tafereel's publishers for copyright infringement for publishing the play in the text. So that's how we have a record that already by December 1720, you know, these images were being circulated. There are also playing cards that show up in the print. We have a wonderful hand-colored example here that people could actually take out of the volume, even sort of cut out and play with and manipulate. So the question of like audience engagement with these images, these sort of objects, these prints, is really interesting to think about. And then we've just arrived a kind of wonderful magic lantern that's going to, the theme of the magic lantern and magic illusionists, who are both seen in the 18th century as truth tellers and also kind of, you know, purveyors of illusions, of trickery. They show up throughout the Tafereel. And so we're going to have an actual magic lantern, which is from the 19th century, but which certainly conceptually relates to the show in the exhibition. And then here's just a very quick preview of the design of the show. And, you know, again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to take you through every detail, but it just gives you a basic plan of the different sections that we've divided. We decided not to continue the kind of cast of characters. That wasn't going to be the structuring conceit of the exhibition layout. It didn't quite work in terms of the narrative we wanted to tell. So we have a couple of sections devoted to John Law, to Lady Credit, who's also a kind of version of Madame Compagnie, or Madame Law. But then otherwise, we tell a story starting on the left. These are the different sections of the exhibition: selling the New World, some of this kind of propaganda, maps, promotional materials that the Compagnie des Indes circulates about the promise of riches to be gained from investment in the Louisiana colony and in the South Sea territories, creating a bull market, which shows the different stock exchange centers in London, Paris, and Amsterdam, and also talks a little bit about how this whole stock speculation got underway. John Law, prints related to him, Lady Credit, active participation of women in the bubbles, All the World's a Stage, this theatrical conceit or metaphor, images of masquerade, Commerce Goes to Hell, which is kind of when the bubbles begin to collapse and you have these mobs, parodying these triumphal processions and mayhem ensuing. And then Afterlives, which speak to the recurring sort of the resonance that this story has in later periods, most prominently during the French Revolution, when paper money gets printed again in the form of assignats. And we have this wonderful fan with trompe-l'oeil images of assignats that's going to be in the exhibition. And then one contemporary image by the artist Grayson Perry, which is called Animal Spirits, a term that was coined actually at the time of the bubbles to speak to the kind of animalistic impulses that arise with financial speculation, but which also relates quite specifically to the 2008 bubbles. And then you can see here in the top left of this plan, our designers. We have a wonderful design team that we're working with. Barbara Sir is doing the design, the layout of the exhibition itself. And then there's also a group known as the graphics office, Angela Vulangas and Doug Klaus, who are doing some of the excellent graphic design. And they've just kind of hot off the presses. This is all in process and it may be modified, but this is kind of where we are at the moment. And they're modifying some existing cases to face them with these plexiglass mirrored panels, which I think, the idea of mirrors and mirroring, the great mirror of Folly, but also mirrors show up as these luxury commodities and goods that get traded, represented in that Jolin print. And then of course, the conceptual themes of illusion, of trickery, and also of reflection. And it's the question of what is the Taffa reel? Was it meant to be a kind of reflection on these events? Was it supposed to help audiences kind of work through the trauma of them? It raises a lot of questions about its own function. And then here's lastly, just a wonderful, that we just received today from the designers, a kind of first pass at an elevation view of the layout of the show itself, some of the objects that are going to be within it, how some of the text panels will be displayed and what they will look like. Okay, I'm going to stop here and unshare my screen and go to Madeleine.
I too want to reiterate the thanks that Nina and Meredith already have expressed. The thank you to Françoise and Georges Selz, as well as to Jeffrey, and to the Bard Graduate Center, just for making tonight's events possible. I also want to take this opportunity to thank my co-curators and co-authors, Nina and Meredith, who sort of dragged me into the 18th century, and I wasn't a period that I was, deeply familiar with, but it's been such a joy working with both of them, just best people, and just wanted to thank them as well. And it's also just, the pleasure of getting to know the library's collections better. I mean, it's one of the privileges of working at a place like NYPL is just this constant voyage of discovery. It's just, I was generally aware that we had this collection of 5 cylinder boxes of so-called South Sea bubble prints, so they were labeled that way. And then when Meredith approached me, I said, yeah, I think we have some stuff. And lo and behold, it turns out we have probably, one of the unrivaled kind of collections, because it is in fact we not only have the bound volumes, but we have this huge collection that's unbound, and sort of an incredible opportunity to put them all on the wall. And that's supplemented by this incredible collection that's then in the Manuscripts and Archives collection. So, you know, just a wonderful collection. So I just feel like I need to put my plug in there for NYPL, and I've done that now. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I contributed to the volume. So I have written a lot of, or not a lot. I have sort of a naughty interest in flatulent imagery, and so in many ways, the tough reel would have been a perfect place for me to explore this even further. But as it happens, I ultimately lit on a different topic for what I contributed towards the book, and that was I was interested in the tough reel's reliance on a variety of art historical sources, especially the tough reel's repeated reference to the printed works of three early modern artists, Hieronymus Bosch, Peter Bruegel the Elder, and Jacques Callot. And I wanted to think more about what it was about them and what about these particular artists that made them so uniquely suited to telling the story of the tough reel. The tough reel's reliance on images annotated with text has encouraged comparison with the emblem book, and the volume has consequently been described as quote unquote an emblem book writ large. While I don't disagree with this assessment, it does seem to me that the volume invites other hitherto unstudied modes of engagement. And one of these is the volume's affinities with the recueil, the French term used to describe both published volumes of high-quality reproductive engravings with explanatory texts and self-curated private print collections usually assembled in albums. The recueil flourished in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and I argue played a critical role in the tough reel's sense of itself as a verzameling. And you can see here, just I highlighted the detail because it's not particularly bold within the title page, but it certainly is there that it conceives of itself as a collection. And it truly is a collection of a sort of idiosyncratic, cobbled together one arrangement of visual and textual sources. As many scholars have already noted, the tough reel owes its distinctive assemblage of text and images in large part to the hurried circumstances of its creation. Rushed to press in late 1720, the tough reel's anonymous consortium of publishers had little to no time to pull together the volume, let alone arrange for brand new visual content, and they frequently fell back on existing plates and illustrations to design the volume's contents. Turning this handicap to their advantage, the publishers' repurposing of previously published plates and well-known imagery became itself a strategy, one that allowed them to develop an unusually nuanced and layered account of the circumstances surrounding the bubble's demise. About half of the tough reel's prints were designed from scratch. The remainder is represented by images that are either restrikes of existing plates, new textual inscriptions, or imaginative riffs on established compositions. One of the key images for thinking about the latter sorts of images, and especially the tough reel's reliance on the published works of Bosch, Bruegel, and Callot, is many have stones in their heads. As should be immediately evident from the comparison I show here, the tough reel's image is a restrike of a broadside published after 1616, titled "Come Men and Women and Have Your Stone Cut Out." In fact, the only difference between the 1720 and 1616 images is the erasure of the original texts and reinscription of new ones. Both images feature groups of men having rocks or stones of madness surgically removed from their heads, an idea the prints lift from late 16th century engraving of four men being operated upon. The circa 1570 print credits its invention to Peter Bruegel the Elder, an artist who circulated many of Bosch's inventions as his own and who helped to popularize Bosch's bizarre and unsettling subject matter. A print after Bruegel, known as the Blue Ship, or Blue Boat, is the source, meanwhile, for the tall, skinny person at far left. And I don't know whether I can get this figure over here. Instead of skippering a load of inebriated carnival revelers or a ship of fools, as he does in Bruegel's print, however, this figure stands inside the sort of earthenware pitcher from which Bosch's revelers have swigged, making his vessel a sort of boozy wine jar. Also, whereas the original inscription on the 1616 print simply states, quote, "While tobacco chases away all my illness, it is a wonder how my stone stays so large," The revised 1720 inscription states, quote, "See how slender are all my members. That's how I've been cut from the stone. My only possession is lack," end quote. Not content to portray the figure just as an example of folly, the Taffrail's inscription frames the figure's emaciation as a consequence of the poverty or lack that is the effect of his craven bouts of stock speculation. The image further minds Callot's frontispiece to the Varie Figure Gobbi for the two figures at top center. These ones over here. Pointing to the lowbrow, not to say shitty sources for his inventions, Callot's motif of a figure probing his companion's buttocks with the writing quills repurposed in the Taffrail to feature Bombardio, wielding a pair of tongs in an effort to pull a nugget from his prone partner's derriere. The print augments Callot's scatological humor by comparing the removal of the stone of madness to the extraction of a rock-hard turd. In the sort of carnivalesque upside-down world of the bubble, Bombardio's patient is having his stone removed not from his brain, however, but from his ass, making him literally, I dare say, one of the world's first butt heads. In an effort to explain how broadsides like come men and women have your stone cut out functions, Matthijs Ilsink has suggested the image depended on viewers' familiarity with well-known prints who engaged in a process that went, quote, "from looking to reading, to looking more closely, to recognition, to seeing further," end quote. He concludes that the image functions as a sort of memory game for the connoisseur or collector, one who, quote, "goes in search of the provenance of art and the art itself," end quote. The playful characteristics Ilsink noted for the 1616 print are equally true for the Taffrail 1720 restrike. Playing cards and a variety of entertainments feature throughout the Taffrail. I think Meredith already alluded to them, where they represent the activity of trading stocks in terms of games of chance and other light-hearted amusements. A corollary to these sorts of frivolous pastimes, the Taffrail engaged viewers in spotting and recognizing illustrations of folly by the leading masters of the genre, which is to say Bosch, Bruegel, and Callot. The sheet of uncut playing cards I show you here, I might add, were designed to be cut apart and quite literally played with, reinforcing the Taffrail's invitation to play. As I will discuss in greater detail shortly, the act of cutting the prints is consonant with the methods contemporary collectors employed for organizing their collections, making this just one more way in which the Taffrail cheekily apes aspects of the contemporary recueil. Visual games of the sorts these prints encourage have their counterparts in 17th century habits of print collection and appreciation. I explore a few examples in the book, but let me point to just one example here. The owner of over 123,000 prints, the French churchman Michel de Merol, held one of the largest and most important 17th century collections. In keeping with contemporary thought on how such holdings should best be organized, Merol arranged his prints according to carefully chosen headings and then painstakingly arranged and glued them into albums in a way that invited playful contemplation and comparison. The rubric that bears the most sustained comparison with the Taffrail's preferred artists and subject matter is titled Recueil des pièces facétieuses et bouffonnes, or collection of facetious and buffoonish pieces. To better appreciate its communalities with the Taffrail and to begin to appreciate the Taffrail itself as a sort of recueil of foolish subjects, I show you this opening, which on facing pages shows a Bruegel-like village wedding by Peter van der Borcht above Bosch's blue boat. On the opposite page, a pair of anonymous street vendors in the manner of Callot bracket the wedding dance after Peter Bruegel. Below, we see an engraving of the Folly of the World after Peter Baltans, with spreads that depend on similar, if not identical, compositions by Bosch, Bruegel, and Callot, as well as on the sorts of themes with which the Taffrail engaged. The scrapbooks have close set parallels with the sensibilities of an image, like many have stones in their heads. Merol's method of organizing his prints on the page bears similarity also with many of the images that were designed for the Taffrail from scratch. Consider another sheet from Merol's album, which conjoins a satirical image titled the Moulin l'Horreur, or Mill of Error, with a sheet of vagabonds and cripples after Bosch, an anonymous print titled The Cackle of Women, and an engraving that is loosely related to a composition by Bruegel of a sleeping merchant being fleeced by a monkey, titled Tis om te lachen, or It's Made to Laugh. The page combines artists and subjects that are once again central to the Tafereel's graphic and satirical manner, as seen, for example, here in the defeated stock jobber in the chair of Jingles. Pictured against an airy background, the scene is literally filled with clouds. The constellation of figures that radiate from the windmill at center read as so many snippets or individual vignettes, reinforcing the image's pastiche sensibility. The Tafereel's method of arranging the contents of many of its images is akin, in other words, to the methods Marot used to cut, paste, and arrange his collection of facetious and buffoonish subprints. The Tafereel's riff on Charles Perrault's Cabinet des Beaux-Arts ou Recueil des Estampes offers another opportunity to consider the volume's recueil-like qualities. As Christelle Smentek observed, the recueil was designed to, quote, glorify their owners by publicizing the magnificence of their collections, end quote. The Tafereel's reliance on Perrault's image of poesy or poetry for its depiction of the South Sea Company having risen to the top by wind has the opposite intention, however. Stripped of her glory and cast as a wanton wreck, the Tafereel's figure, who is now surrounded by dog-eared ledgers rather than books of lyrical verse, has the effect of spoofing the recueil's smug air of self-congratulation. Etched swiftly and sloppily, in contrast to the glorious impression by Pierre Lepotre, the Tafereel's anonymous print is pointedly unrefined, making it undesirable as a commodity for the collector's cabinet. Modifications like these have the effect of calling into question the recueil's raison d'être, and with it the very enterprise of the print collector. The analogy between the frippery of collecting prints and the accumulation of paper money is hard to miss. I end my talk here with a print I purchased for the show, an anonymous hand-colored etching showing a tableau of assignats with an etching after Callot. After the cataclysmic collapse of the introduction of paper money under John Law, the French Revolutionary somewhat surprisingly resurrected the currency in the form of the assignat around 1789. As in the case of Law's money, the revolutionary paper currency ended up being a spectacular failure. What I would draw your attention to is the role prints by Callot once again played in visualizing that fiasco. Here we see Callot's beggar with a walking stick, now gaudily hand-colored, atop a disheveled pile of French Revolutionary paper money and other paper detritus. Given the appearance of having been casually tossed atop this heap, Callot's beggar conveys a sense of the dire straits awaiting those who put their faith in paper money. Viewed through the lens of contemporary print appreciation, however, one can't help but notice that the etching is not just qualitatively inferior, but even unfaithful. Not only does a vagabond appear in reverse, but he also now carries a hat, anomalies that any connoisseur worth his salt would immediately flag as fake and unworthy of sustained attention. It's no accident, indeed, that Callot's skirt or beggars were the most heavily pirated of all Callot's prints, a circumstance that lends credibility to this bad Callot copy. Continuing the practice already employed by the Tafereel, the tableau uses an invention by Callot to address anxiety about the hoarding of valueless paper instruments. Caveat emptor, they remind, beware those who put stock in worthless paper trifles. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Madeleine. Thanks to all three of you. I think you've really teased our curiosity to see this exhibition when it finally opens. I think given the hour, we'll open the floor to questions. As Laura mentioned, those of you who are on the panelist side can do so by using the raise hand feature. Those of you who are attending in the webinar can use the Q&A feature. And while I'm navigating those, which is a bit of new territory for me, let me just take the chair's privilege and compliment you on your ability to tie this intangible phenomenon to material objects. I think that's something of great interest. And I was just struck in all of your presentations at how these bubbles and their aftermaths not only spawned material objects or echoes in real things, but the way that material things, household objects, bellows, pipes, screens, mirrors, were invoked as metaphors to carry meaning in this print, and that their resonance would have worked because of the experiences that people had with the objects. So it makes me turn a little bit to Meredith's question, which she dangled, which is, what is the motivation for wanting things that reminded you of this this tragedy in which you may have lost your shirt. And that I think we have to include the book itself, as Madeleine just evoked. It is very much a physical object that was meant to be manipulated, cobbled together, as a commodity, but also meant in a way to be deconstructed by the eventual users. So while I'm sorting the questions, maybe I'd love to hear you three talk with each other a little bit about what you've come to understand about what is the motivation behind this visual and material culture that you've showed us today.
So can I just say quickly, that's a really wonderful observation, Jeffrey. And, you are complimenting us on bringing together intangibles with objects, but it's actually been a very, it creates anxiety when you are in the position of doing that, because you do run the risk of thinking, oh my God, like this is all, where does projection, turn into something that is actually historically reliable? And I think that becomes a problem, and I mean, there's a lot to be said for the issue of intangibility, especially when we think about what doesn't get represented in those prints. And the problem is that stuff does get represented. And I think that as art historians, we have this responsibility to actually try to look beyond what is shown and actually really talk about what isn't shown. I mean, this entire kind of we didn't get a chance to address the South Sea bubble, but that whole bubble actually would not have taken place had England not received from Spain the contract to supply the Spanish Americas with slaves, with enslaved Africans. And so because this doesn't get represented, it does create this question of like, how can we go about speaking about it from the perspective of objects? So I think that's a really interesting question that we've been dealing with in terms of how to think about it for the exhibition. And I have a very short answer to your question about why and I think Meredith actually might have more to say, because I know you've been thinking about this with your students, but the question of like, what role do these objects play in culture at a time of a disaster? I mean, I think from my perspective, they are the equivalent of like primetime comedy, it's like, if it weren't for SNL, like how would we have survived the Trump years? So I feel as if I do think that comedy is the best, that laughter is the best medicine. And I think that the pandemic was actually very clarifying in that respect, that you cling to these vehicles for catharsis.
Meredith, do you want to pick up?
I see that there's a couple of questions, so I don't want to, I just say really quickly, you asked us how we've come to kind of understand this volume. And I feel like the more time we spend with it, the less we actually understand it. And I do think that what Nina said is, well, the part about the absence is what's not shown is really as important as what's shown. That's a hugely significant point. But I also think, yes, on the one hand, laughter is the best medicine. On the other, this gets kind of turned into art. Does it get aestheticized? Does it desensitize us? Does this kind of saturation of image culture ultimately, make us kind of forget about the realities of the trauma? And also, people didn't really learn from the mistakes of this disaster. Within a few years, trade had kind of picked back up again, and you don't hear much about these images, but beyond the sort of the moment. So I think we have some ideas, some kind of speculation, so to speak, about how they functioned, but I think it also continues to be a kind of open question. And I think they also ask that question themselves. There's something deeply kind of transgressive and a little bit subversive about, a compilation of images that asks you to kind of distrust the nature of images. It speaks to this theme of illusionism. And Nina and Madeleine both developed this in their own essays for the volume, this idea of a kind of nihilism or a kind of like defeatist attitude. So there's the negative as much as the kind of like cathartic moment. There's also something darker at work.
So can we go first to Sarah Cohen, who has a question directly related to this, and then I'd like to call on Susan Weber.
Sure.
Thanks. That was really fascinating. A whole lot to think about, but something that Jeffrey said, and just a couple of things that were mentioned and I can't even remember exactly which presentation it was, but somebody mentioned alchemy. And I wonder if there is something related to the debates over alchemy and also the satires of alchemy. I mean, alchemy was so, at this point, teetering into the area of superstition, and yet we know that people like Isaac Newton were, passionately interested in alchemy. And this whole idea of faith and having somehow this intangible faith that this paper stuff could actually stand for something that is tangible and real, it seems to me to have everything to do with the relationship between the printed image and the actually crafted objects, many of which were crafted out of gold and silver. So it's a very amorphous question, but I wonder if there are any intersections here with the debates over alchemy and the way in which they relate to the visual arts at this point.
I can sort of begin to answer that really excellent question. I'm not an expert on the debates on alchemy by any means, but what I do understand about alchemy really comes from a very recent book by Arnaud Oran, which is an account of the Mississippi bubble. And he has a lot of fascinating discussion about the huge investment on the part of the regent in trying to figure out how to take these minerals that were being excavated in Louisiana and actually convert them into gold. And so there was a kind of state-sponsored science that wasn't entirely a disaster. So they did find in Galena, which is in Illinois, they did excavate Galen, which actually did have the kind of capacity to be turned into like a more valuable mineral. And so this wasn't all for naught. But as you are quite right to observe, these prints were absolutely parodying the kind of state-sponsored effort to turn something into something else. And I think that they do end up collapsing state-sponsored alchemy into this other effort to kind of to make people believe that paper can be as valuable as money.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
I'm wondering how you are treating misogyny, because looking at these images, the misogynist element is so overt, and you're three women who have done the show, and how will you express in your labels and in the reception and programming around the show this sort of very offensive misogynist element of the drawings and some of the other ephemera that we have seen?
And can I piggyback on Susan's question, because it's something I noticed in reading the book and listening tonight, that the negative female stereotypes that are so often invoked. I'm trying to reconcile that with your point that women were actually very much involved in this phenomenon as investors, and that it actually led them out into a new sphere. So was any of this satire meant for them?
Meredith, should I start to speak about some, aspects of this issue, and then do you want to talk? And I can handle maybe the misogyny, and then you can handle the women in the marketplace, which is something that you have researched.
Yeah, I thought Madeleine might also have maybe some connection to some of the earlier material and connection in relation to these themes, but sure, we could.
Well, let's get to Susan's question. How are you dealing with that in the show?
Okay.
Because it is very striking.
Nina, do you want to speak to the misogyny or the?
So so how are we dealing with misogyny? I mean, we do speak about why women are so central to the Taffereel at length in the book. And we do have, this naked Fortuna. Obviously, I think there really was, as Susan is observing, I think the misogyny wasn't simple. I think that there was a kind of anxiety that ends up taking its most facile expression in showing in a society that's becoming effeminized, and in seeing the dangers of seduction and the dangers of falling for the sort of false prospect of wealth, seeing that take the form of a kind of nude temptress. But I feel like that there's misogyny that's also ends up accompanying other kinds of very disturbing imagery, you know, about Jews and foreigners. So I think that there's something actually very conservative about the tafel that we've been really interested in on the three of us. That there is, I think, a sort of a concern about the kinds of society that is sort of transforming over into one that does want everything to be converted over into movable wealth. And this is a society that actually ends up benefiting women, which is something that Meredith, you know, can speak to. So women were very actively participating in the marketplace. And I think that the idea that men and women and also people of all different stripes are coming together in ways that they hadn't hitherto was also something that became ripe for the pluck as a source of satire. But I think Meredith, do you want to speak about the Madame Law section of the exhibition, which maybe does kind of give nuance to how we're treating the gender issue in the exhibition?
Well, I think part of it is that, you know, just as the tafel itself it's constantly sort of oscillating between the kind of mythological, allegorical dimension of these figures, Fortuna, Folly, so on, and then real life events and in a kind of almost like a documentary reportage. And I think to tell the story of, you know, the very powerful kind of role that women played, and the fact that in the end they came out better, the women investors ultimately sort of fared a little bit better within the bubbles and within the credit economy. And I think that their ability to thrive, but also to transgress, you know, to represent this real mobility and this kind of blurring of boundaries that was occurring at this moment. I mean, this was quite threatening. And I think that's one of the reasons for this kind of backlash in terms of the misogynistic ways in which they were portrayed. And so hopefully by telling the story of women's active role in the bubbles, that might help to explain some of the ways in which they're demonized. But I don't know, I think it may be that I'm not sure which images you sort of were responding to the most, you know, what seemed the most kind of viscerally offensive in terms of, I'd be really curious to know. I think they're equal opportunity offenders. Everyone gets kind of demonized in a way, but what were you thinking? What are you thinking of specifically? What are the images in your head from the materials that?
It's image after image, particularly Madame Law, and I remember reading about the bubble, particularly in England, and ladies' maids invested heavily in. Everyone wanted to get rich, and there were huge numbers of suicides. And it wasn't all very pretty, as you know, and I'm just wondering, you know, in this highly sensitive climate that we're all in, how we describe such pictorial images and use them in a way to show how different people were considered in this century. I worry about how you talk about the trade of the slaves and the lack of images, frankly, of the slaves, which were so much a part of the way the bubble made money for some people. And it's just
there's at least one, right, which is the other vignette that you didn't show us, Meredith, on the upper right. You showed us the upper left of the French people being basically enslaved and sent off to Louisiana, and the other vignette shows enslaved Africans who are there.
I mean, I just finished a Majolica show, and frankly, we had to rewrite a lot of the labels our show too is a year and a half late because they didn't talk, and our labels didn't touch colonialism and the brutality of working in factories, and we needed to bring the agenda of what we were discussing full round to make our viewers who will see the show more aware of the pain that was also behind the making of this very highly colorful ceramic ware.
Fortunately, we do have at the NYPL a lot of historical material that we're including the Code Noir for Louisiana, the Asiento. So we're absolutely trying to do justice to a story that gets repressed in the visuals.
Mm-hmm. Could I, before we go farther, drop in a comment from one of the attendees? This is Robert Hogue, who asks, could someone, one of you on the panel, please comment on the relationships of the printed imagery with dozens of popular medallic works by Christian Vermouth? And another question that came from Kiel Choi is also about the relationship of this graphic satire to traditions of graphic satire elsewhere in Europe, at the moment. And in a sense, why Amsterdam is the nucleus, or the sort of the cradle of satire that's really clearly in its multilingual nature meant to spread across the continent with the speed of rumor. Anyone want to take that? And I see we're at 7:25, so this may have to be our last question before we break.
Oh, we have a few more hands up. I don't know if we can go a little bit, just at least the hands that are up in the panel, maybe.
I just saw them. I'm sorry. I see Deborah, Sarah, Heath, and Elise. We'll have to talk fast.
I mean, I would just quickly say the Christian Vermouth, these satirical medals are very much aping, royal medal. They're trying to work within that kind of same visual iconographical language. I mean, that's part of like their power as satire. And in terms of satirical prints at the time, they're drawing upon a lot of anti-Louis XIV satirical imagery that's circulating. Madame Law is kind of constantly, they're images against the king that represent him and the sway of his mistresses, Madame de Maintenon, Madame de Montespan, during the war, that are published during the War of the Spanish Succession, shortly before the bubbles get reworked within the Tafereel, and Louis XIV becomes John Law. Madame de Maintenon becomes either the Mississippi nun, who's a character, or Madame Law. But maybe Madeleine, you are the expert in satirical print culture, so you might have some thoughts.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Amsterdam really as being, always a place of great tolerance. And of course, the bubble was also a Netherlandish phenomenon. So it was entirely in keeping with sort of the Amsterdam as a place of sort of permissiveness, and also the history of the bubble itself, that the publication would have taken place there, would have been issued from there. I don't have, I'm not quite sure what, I mean, there's certainly Hogarth is also making prints at the same time. So one can think about him in terms of the South Sea bubble. But, and his language is strikingly different. I mean, he's not using, he's not relying or sort of recycling some of the imagery that we saw so much as part of the Tafereel, which I think is, it's really interesting with regard to that. It's the makers of that of this particular volume. I mean, Hogarth was really coming up with new material and new ways to represent it. But it turns out that a lot of the sort of imagery, including the sort of wheel of fortune, is something that also is in the Tafereel. There's a sort of an imaginary that they all sort of are grappling with, even if the graphic language with which they express it looks rather different.
Thank you. With apologies to Deborah and Heath, I think I want to privilege the guests tonight. So if we could have Sarah and then Elise, and then we'll wrap up. And other questions, I'm very happy to forward to the panelists for more private discussion. Sarah, you're on.
The briefest thank you to the presenters for having made this a kind of virtual visit, and I hope we all get to convene at the NYPL next September. In the meantime, one of the things I thought was so fascinating about these presentations is how you showed us how the bubble and its thematics of trickery and alchemy map onto or are activated by artistic practices like trompe-l'oeil, those amazing objects. And with that in mind, it made me wonder, as we're looking at that electric, at least it looked like electric colorism of the Jouvin print, if there's more to be said about like the stakes of color relative to this material.
And could I add, who put that color on? Is you were suggesting that in some cases it's the consumer who's doing it as part of the engagement with this fascinating object or repurposing.
Madeleine, you might be able
my understanding is of these prints, of hand-colored prints, was something you paid extra for. So, it wasn't, and sometimes that work was even done by women. So there you're getting into kind of women's work again. But it is interesting. It is a question, and it certainly, I'm not sure about the Joulin print. That's actually not in our collection. It's in New Orleans, but the ones that are in our collection, they do add something to our experience of the image. With the playing cards, for example, they do. I mean, and one of the prints I even got, we actually never included it. It did have a playing card, and the hearts themselves were then hand colored. Nothing else was. And there was a way in which they were trying to, I don't know, perhaps allude to this. I don't know, this sort of illusionism. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what's on to that.
Contemporary debates in the French Academy about, design versus color, or Poussin versus Rubens, or, because these are all very, the seductiveness of color and the danger of that. It would fit right in if it were the case.
Yeah.
But, well, we'll think about that. Elise, last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody. This was a wildly fascinating topic and presentation. And my question is, it's a comment and a question. The idea of having a visual arts exhibition about economics and about a financial bubble is really intriguing. And at this moment, when I think a lot of us in the academic and museum space are trying to think more about how we can bring a history of economics to our presentation of works of art, it's kind of spot on, right? And so I really appreciated your bringing in decorative arts objects and actually thinking about, these are the product of a chain of wealth that comes from X. And I wondered if, while you've been working on this, you've been thinking about, what's the takeaway, or how can this inspire different projects or ways of thinking about how we can better think about capitalism and the economy as a place where labor, colonialism, empire all intersect. In this moment where people are thinking about race, I think really we need to be thinking about capitalism, right? And so it's just incredibly important. And I wondered if this has you sort of thinking about how we can look at these issues through objects that are not about economics, but they're all about economics, really.
Well, no, I think it's a great question and a great point. And part of the reason why we included some of these objects is, the invitation of this series, which gave us a prompt. But I think it's turning, all of our wheels in terms of how do you bring that history to light? In some ways, it's kind of, that story is being told through the language of these prints, but as we've said, they're illusion and indirection and obfuscation, and there's a lot of gaps that things that they don't say. And on the flip side, if you're doing an exhibition of some of these luxury goods and interior design objects that we alluded to earlier, where and how do you kind of reveal and write in that history? I think in wall text, in a sort of conventional museum display, I think it's really difficult to do. I think the Met's show, the recent show on value in an early modern period, that was a kind of great, really inspiring way to think about how to introduce some of those questions in a museum show, but I think also through digital projects that supplement these kinds of exhibitions is another way to think about it. I mean, this has made a group of us want to start a whole kind of crowdsourced digital project on artist colonial networks of the period. And maybe that could translate into a museum exhibition. But again, as you say, there's so many different layers of that history and only so much you can present within the, you know, the limits of 100-word piece of wall text, a kind of tombstone label. So I do think we can, you know, mobilize other kind of platforms and formats to bring in some of those histories.
Well, I think that question just, it reminds us of the importance of revisiting this 300 years later and to see what's changed, what hasn't changed, and the question of what kinds of labor, what kinds of relationships are being obscured behind the screen, you know, which is one of the most evocative to me images that we didn't see tonight, but will be in the show, is the screen in the English context with the portrait of Walpole, and all these nefarious things are happening behind the screen and you can't see them except in the mirror indirectly. So your exhibition, I think, is trying to show us about how print culture makes visible the invisible and thematizes this question of what are we not seeing when we put our trust in images. Anyway, with that.
Can I just say one thing to that, just to respond quickly? It's really, really true. And it's also, you know, this is mediated through so many different layers of history. And, you know, as Susan said, like, the world has fundamentally changed, you know, even in the past. So the show that we wanted to do 2 years ago, in some ways it's very, very relevant, but there's huge issues and questions. And, you know, 6 months from now, so should we say something about GameStop in our wall text? Well, who knows what the next crisis is going to be in September. And so I think, like, history is such a moving target. And I think it's a really good point that you raised about, you know, the kind of the questions that we're asking now might not have been the questions we asked 11 months ago. And I think you've all given us such great kind of ideas and things to chew on. And I really would encourage you, please email us if you had a question or a comment. Like, we're actively writing the wall text right now, and we really welcome your input and feedback and pushback, you know, in any of these respects. It's really useful for us. Thank you for that.
Stay tuned, and stay tuned for further Selz events on the same Selz time and the same Selz channel. In the meantime, thank you so much to all of our 3 panelists and for everyone who joined us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.